It was always the same smell of burnt coffee that woke Livia before her alarm clock. The small apartment on the third floor of a building without an elevator in Cantagum, a metropolitan area of Belo Horizonte, had thin walls that let the noise of the street in even before sunrise. She got up every day at 5:42 a.m., not because the alarm clock was set for that time, but because her body had already learned that there was no point in waiting any longer. No one would knock on her door. No one would ask if she had slept well. The day began when she decided it would begin, and ended when the silence became unbearable enough that sleep finally came out of pity. Livia was 36 years old and had a face that most people couldn't describe after seeing her. She wasn't ugly, she was invisible. The kind of woman who walks into a restaurant and no waiter notices, who queues at the bank and someone always cuts in line, who speaks in a work meeting, and the phrase is repeated minutes later by someone else as if it were a new idea. She had dark brown eyes, wavy hair that she tied in a loose bun every morning, and small hands that were always busy, holding folders, cleaning surfaces, serving coffee to colleagues who never returned a smile. Livia was efficient, discreet, and utterly dispensable in the perception of everyone around her. She worked as an administrative assistant at a fertility clinic. The irony of it never escaped her notice. Every day, she organized the files of couples who were there to fulfill their dreams of having children. She checked exams, scheduled procedures, wrote formal emails informing about ovarian stimulation and embryo transfer protocols. She typed words that carried the weight of entire lives: hope, attempt, cycle, embryo, positive, while her own uterus remained empty and her heart even emptier. It wasn't that Livia had never tried. At 28, she almost got married. Renato was a civil engineer, conventionally handsome, with a wide smile and even greater ambition. They dated for 3 years. Livia loved him the way women like her usually love, in silence, with actions. She ironed his shirts, remembered her father-in-law's blood pressure medication, memorized the names of all his co-workers so she could ask about them naturally. Renato liked her. That was the word he used. Liked, never loved. And when he met Fernanda, an architect with straight hair and an easy laugh, at a networking event, Livia saw the difference etched on his face even before he needed to say anything. He broke up with her on a Sunday, after lunch, with the dishes still in the sink. He said he needed to experience new things, and that she deserved someone who truly loved her. The phrase hurt more than any insult, because it confirmed what Livia had always known, deep down since childhood: she was insufficient. Not that she wasn't unpretty, not that she wasn't unintelligent, she was simply insufficient, just insufficient. After Renato came 2 brief relationships that barely deserved the name. The first, with a coworker who only contacted her when he was lonely. The second, with a man she met through an app who, in the 3rd week, asked if she minded splitting the motel bill. Livia laughed, paid, and never responded to his messages again. Not out of pride, out of exhaustion. At 34, she went to a gynecologist's office for routine checkups, and during the conversation mentioned that she would like to have children someday. The doctor looked at her with that kind of professional compassion that tries not to seem like pity and said that, although it was still possible, time was beginning to be a relevant factor. Declining ovarian reserve. Not alarming, but real. Livia left the appointment and sat on a bus stop bench for 40 minutes without realizing that 2 buses had already passed. She didn't cry. She no longer had the habit of crying. She just sat there, looking at the street, with the feeling that her body was counting down without anyone having even started timing it. It was around this time that the idea of being a mother ceased to be a desire and became a physical pain. Not just any pain, it was like a phantom organ. Something she never had but missed as if she did. It had been ripped away. She looked at children in the supermarket and felt her chest tighten. She heard babies laughing in parks and had to change her route, not out of envy, out of grief. An anticipatory grief for something that might never exist. At work, she followed everything closely. She knew that independent reproduction was possible. Artificial insemination, sperm bank treatment, in vitro fertilization, but she also knew that the cost was prohibitive for someone earning 2 minimum wages and living alone. She made spreadsheets, researched affordable clinics, considered loans. The numbers never added up. Reality had a knack for being mathematical when hope tried to be poetry. It was on an ordinary Wednesday, near the end of the workday, that Livia overheard a conversation that would change everything. She was in the clinic's break room, washing her mug, always the same white mug with a coffee stain that never came out, when 2 colleagues came in talking about a patient, a 41-year-old businessman who had come to the clinic alone. He wanted to have a child, but there was a legal requirement for the procedure he wanted to undergo. He needed a partner, not necessarily a wife, but a companion with whom he could share the parental project. The colleagues laughed at how serious, almost rigid he was, and how out of place he seemed sitting in the waiting room surrounded by loving couples. "He looks like he swallowed a coat hanger," one of them said, and they both laughed. Livia didn't laugh. She stood still with the mug under the tap, feeling the warm water run through her fingers, thinking about something she still couldn't fully formulate. A man who wanted to be a father, alone, needing someone to make it possible. What went through her head was absurd and unthinkable. And that's exactly why she couldn't stop thinking. His name was Rafael Montero. She saw it in his medical record 2 days later. Not out of curiosity, but because the file needed to be organized and his name was there in capital letters, next to fields filled with clinical data and a note in red. Patient without a partner for a parenting project. Referred for legal counsel. Livia stared at those words long enough for the computer screen to go dark. Rafael showed up at the clinic again the following week. Livia was at reception that day because the regular receptionist was absent. He came in at 9:15 a.m., wearing a navy blue dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and dark trousers that looked like they had been ironed that morning. He had an angular face, thick eyebrows, dark hair with gray strands at the temples. He wasn't handsome in the classic sense. He was the kind of man people look at twice, not for his looks, but for his presence. He occupied space in a way that seemed involuntary, as if his body were too big for the world around him. As he approached the counter, he looked at Livia and said good morning in a deep, flat voice. She responded with her usual politeness, handed him the form to fill out, and indicated the seats in the waiting room. He did all this in silence, sat down, crossed his hands on his knees, and stared at the floor. Livia watched him over the monitor. There was something in that posture that she recognized. It wasn't arrogance. It was loneliness disguised as composure. Later, when he left the appointment, he went back to the counter to schedule a follow-up. Livia checked the available dates and, while typing, noticed him watching her. Not in the way men usually looked at women. There was no desire or evaluation. It was more as if he were trying to understand something about her that he couldn't name. Have you worked here for a long time? He asked. 7 years, she replied, without lifting her eyes from the screen. And do you like it? Livia stopped typing for a second. No one had ever asked that question. In 7 years, not a single patient, not a single colleague, not a single boss. She looked at him and saw that the question was genuine. He wasn't making small talk. He really wanted to know. I like it, he said, and felt that he was lying and telling the truth at the same time. He nodded, took the appointment confirmation, and left without saying anything else. In the weeks that followed, Livia found herself thinking about Rafael at unexpected moments, washing dishes, waiting for the bus, folding laundry. She didn't think of him romantically. She thought of him like someone looking in a mirror and seeing something familiar reflected, but inverted. He was everything she wasn't, financially stable, respected, present, but there was a point of intersection between them that she couldn't ignore. They both wanted the same thing. They were both alone, and they were both racing against time. The idea returned with more force each day, an insane, impossible proposal that no reasonable person would make. But Livia had never been treated as a reasonable person, so perhaps it made sense for her to act in a way that the world considered irrational. She waited until his next appointment. She prepared for days. She wrote and erased mental phrases dozens of times. On the morning of the appointment, she wore a blouse she didn't usually wear, not out of vanity, but because she needed to feel like she was presenting herself, not hiding. When Rafael left the appointment and approached the counter to schedule his appointment, she gathered everything she had inside and said, "Mr. Montero, may I speak with you for a moment, in private?" He seemed surprised, but nodded. She led him to the meeting room at the end of the hall, the same room where the doctors held their meetings. Difficult news for couples. The irony, once again, did not escape his notice. They sat facing each other. Livia interlaced her fingers on the table so he wouldn't see her hands trembling. And then, in a voice firmer than she expected, she said, "I know you're looking for a partner to make the parenting project viable. I know because I work here and have access to information that I shouldn't be using in this way, and I apologize for that. But I need to be honest, because this might be the only chance I have." She took a deep breath. "I also want to be a mother, more than anything. And I'm not in a position to do it alone, neither financially nor because of what the law requires, nor legally in the way I would like. So I'm here to propose something that will sound absurd, and I understand if you want to get up and leave right now." Raphael didn't move. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that disconcerted her. "I propose a marriage of convenience, on paper, to make the treatment possible for both of us. You would have the partner you need for the procedure. I would have access to the treatment I can't afford on my own. We would both have what we want, a child." The silence that followed lasted what seemed like a lifetime. Livia felt the cold sweat on her palms. He felt his face burning. He felt like getting up, apologizing, and never returning to that building. But then, Raphael did something unexpected. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and, for the first time since she had known him, offered something that almost resembled a smile. Not a mocking smile, a smile of recognition. "Did you think of this on your own?" he asked. "Try. How long has it been?" 3 weeks. "And he didn't tell anyone?" "I have no one to tell. The sentence came out without calculation, without drama. It was simply the truth. And perhaps that's precisely why it hit Raphael in the chest like a punch, because he didn't have one either. And hearing someone say aloud what he felt in silence was the kind of thing that disarmed even the most armored men. He remained silent for another long moment. Then he leaned forward, rested his elbows on the table, and said, "Give me a week. I need to think." Livia nodded. She stood up, smoothed her blouse with trembling hands, and returned to the counter as if nothing had happened. She attended to patients, organized files, answered emails. And inside, she felt like she had just jumped off a cliff without knowing if there was a safety net below. The next 7 days were the longest of her life. She didn't sleep properly. She would wake up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, replaying every word, every pause, every tiny expression on his face. She regretted it about 20 times. She thought about sending a message saying it had been a mistake, but she didn't have his number, and even if she did, she wouldn't have the courage. The following Thursday, Raphael showed up at the clinic without an appointment. He asked to speak with her. They went to the same room. They sat in the same chairs. He placed a folder on the table. Inside was a document drafted by a lawyer, a contract. Livia read the first few lines and felt her blood pound in her temples. It was a modified prenuptial agreement establishing the terms of a civil marriage with the specific purpose of a shared parental project. It defined financial responsibilities, custody, visitation rights, and finally, a clause for amicable dissolution after the birth of the child, should both parties agree. "I thought about it," Raphael said, "and the answer is yes, but with conditions. Everything in writing, everything transparent. And I need you to understand one thing. I'm not doing this out of charity. I'm doing it because it makes sense. For me too." Livia held the document with both hands, as if it were a letter of manumission. She read each line, each paragraph, each legal term. And when she finished, she looked at it and said, "When do we start?" The civil wedding took place 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning at the registry office in the city center. Livia wore a gray suit she had bought at a sale 2 years earlier and had never worn. Raphael wore a dark suit without a tie. The witnesses were his lawyer and a co-worker of Livia's, the only one she considered close enough to ask for something like that, and distant enough not to ask questions. There were no rings. There was no kiss. There were no photos. They signed the papers with the same formality as someone signing a rental contract. And when they left the registry office, each went their own way. Livia took the bus back to work. Raphael got into the black car parked on the corner. She looked out the bus window as his vehicle disappeared into traffic, and he thought that this was probably the saddest and most hopeful scene of his life. The treatment began the following month. Livia needed to have tests done, take hormone medication, and attend weekly appointments. Raphael paid for everything. They saw each other at the clinic as two partners in a delicate venture, polite, efficient, distant. He would ask if she was okay. She would say yes. He would ask if she needed anything. She would say no. And so the days passed, with a cold courtesy that was more uncomfortable than any argument. The change began almost imperceptibly. In the 3rd week of treatment, Livia had an adverse reaction to the hormone medication. Nothing serious, nausea, dizziness, swelling, but enough for her to have to miss work for 2 days. She didn't tell anyone. She stayed home lying on the sofa, eating crackers and watching soap opera reruns with the volume low. On the 2nd night, someone knocked on her apartment door. It was Raphael. He was standing in the narrow hallway, holding a pharmacy bag in one hand and a pot of soup in the other. It wasn't restaurant soup. It was homemade soup, with irregularly cut vegetables and a smell of garlic that filled the entire hallway. "How did you know where I live?" she asked, without opening the door completely. "It's in the contract. Correspondence clause." She didn't know whether to laugh or get angry. She opened the door. He came in, looked around the apartment, the simple furniture, the bookshelf full of used books, the plant on the windowsill that stubbornly refused to die, and said nothing. He put the soup in the kitchen, left the bag of medicine on the table, and turned to leave. "You don't have to stay," said Livia. "I know." But he stayed. He sat in the only armchair in the room, a faded blue armchair that had belonged to her mother, and waited while Livia heated up the soup. They ate in silence. She on the sofa, he in the armchair, with the television in the background showing scenes from a soap opera that neither of them watched. And in that shared silence, something moved. Not dramatically, not with background music, but like a slow subterranean tectonic shift that changes the geography of a place without anyone on the surface noticing. When Raphael left, Livia locked the door and leaned against it. She stayed there for a long time, savoring the taste of vegetables in her mouth and the smell of garlic that still lingered in the air, and realized that it had been years, many years, since someone had cooked for her. In the following days, Raphael began to show up more frequently, never without a reason, never without a practical justification. There was always a logical excuse, a document that needed a signature, a change in the treatment protocol, an appointment that needed to be rescheduled. But documents could be sent by email, Changes could be communicated by phone, and rescheduling was done by the secretary. Livia knew this. Raphael knew that she knew, and neither of them said anything. He discovered she liked coffee with cinnamon when he saw the little cinnamon jar next to the coffee maker. On his next visit, he brought a package of cinnamon sticks from a brand she would never buy. She discovered he didn't know how to cook rice when he confessed, somewhat embarrassed, that he ate out almost every night because he had lived alone since he was 33 and had never learned to cook. One Saturday afternoon, without any planning, Livia found herself teaching Raphael how to make rice in the tiny kitchen of her apartment. He stood too still near the stove, afraid that the oil splattered, and he gripped the wooden spoon with the same firmness he probably used to grip pens in business meetings. "You're holding it like it's a weapon," Livia said. "And isn't it?" he replied, looking at the oil bubbling as if it were lava. She laughed. It was a small, almost involuntary laugh that escaped before she could hold it back. And he looked at her as if that sound was the most unexpected thing he'd heard in months. From then on, the meetings no longer needed excuses. They simply happened. A coffee after the appointment, lunch at a simple restaurant near the clinic, a walk in the park 3 blocks from her apartment, always in the late afternoon, when the light turned golden and the shadows lengthened, as if the day itself were stretching before going to sleep. On one of their walks, they passed a couple pushing a baby stroller. The woman was laughing at something the man had said. The baby was asleep, indifferent to the world. Livia and Raphael passed them in silence, and for a moment the air between them grew heavier, as if that image had materialized something they both thought but didn't say. Livia wondered if he had felt it too. She glanced at him and saw that he was looking ahead with his jaw slightly clenched, the way it always was when he was processing something he didn't want to process. "Do you think it will work?" she asked, without specifying what. "I don't usually invest in things that I think are going to fail," he replied. It was a businessman's phrase, cold, calculated, but the way he said it, his voice a tone lower than normal without looking at her, it revealed that it wasn't calculation. It was fear disguised as confidence. And Livia recognized the trick because it was the same one she used. One afternoon, he took her to see the construction company's office. Not as a formal visit, more like showing a friend's room who's never been to your house. The office occupied an entire floor of a commercial building downtown. It was spacious, organized, with plants in the corners and a glass table that seemed to take up half the main room. Raphael introduced her to the employees as Livia, without a last name, without a title, without explanation. Some seemed confused. Others smiled with that polite smile of someone who doesn't understand but pretends to. In his office, Livia looked at the walls. There were no personal photos, no picture frames, no mementos, nothing to indicate that this space belonged to someone with a life outside of it. Only diplomas, certificates, and an abstract painting that could have been in any office in the world. "You spend 10 hours a day here and you don't even have a single photo," she remarked. Photo of whom? The question wasn't rhetorical, it was genuine. And its unintentional cruelty made Livia swallow hard because there was Raphael's loneliness exposed like a live wire. Not dramatic, not performative, just factual. He didn't have a photo because he had no one to take a photo of. His life was made of things, not people. She looked at the glass table, the leather chair, the view from the window showing an entire city bustling about, and thought that this man had everything the world considers success, and nothing the heart considers sufficient. On their way out, they passed by the reception desk. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with thin-rimmed glasses, looked at Livia with a curiosity that he made no effort to hide. Once they were in the elevator, Raphael said, "Mrs. Marlene has worked with me for 12 years. She's never seen me bring anyone here." Livia didn't know what to answer. She watched the elevator numbers descend, feeling a slight churning in her stomach, and thought that she was entering parts of his life that weren't stipulated in any contract. There were also nights when Livia couldn't sleep and would stay in the apartment's living room, with the light off and the window open, listening to the sounds of the city falling asleep. On those nights, she thought about the choices she had made. She thought about how her whole life seemed to have been a series of waits, waiting for a boyfriend who loved her, waiting for a career that valued her, waiting for a body that would cooperate, waiting for a chance that never came. And now, for the first time, she wasn't waiting. She was acting. She was inside something she herself had created, however crooked and improbable it might be. And that, the feeling of agency, of having decided her own path, was almost as powerful as the desire to be a mother. She also thought about Raphael, the way he tilted his head when he heard something that interested him, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands, as if it were a source of warmth on a cold day, the way his eyes changed, darkening when he spoke of the past, brightening when he looked at her. She thought about these things and tried to categorize what she felt. Gratitude? Yes. Respect? Also. But there was something more, something that grew slowly like a root beneath the earth, invisible but persistent, pushing against the surface until one day it would break through without asking permission. One Friday night, they went to a bookstore together. They hadn't planned it. He had picked her up from the clinic, and the bookstore was on the way. They entered as if entering a temple with the respectful silence that books imposed. Livia went straight to the literature section. Raphael stayed in the nonfiction section, leafing through books on management and economics, with the same expression he used for everything, concentrated, almost stern. After 20 minutes, he appeared beside her, holding a book of poetry. Livia looked at the cover and then at him, surprised. "I didn't know you liked poetry." "I don't like it, but my mother did. She used to read aloud when I was little. I would listen without understanding anything, but I liked the sound." He bought the book. In the car, while they waited for the traffic to clear, Livia asked to see it. She opened it to a random page and read silently. It was a poem about waiting, about planting something and not knowing if it will grow, about trusting in the dark. She closed the book and returned it without comment. But she kept that moment as if she were preserving a mental photograph. Raphael, in a car stopped in traffic, with a book of his mother's poetry and a woman beside him whom he had chosen without choosing. Raphael spoke little about himself, but Livia pieced together fragments of information. He was the only child of a military father and a mother who died when he was 17. He built the company from scratch, a construction firm. He was of medium size and had dedicated most of his adult life to work. He had few friends and no significant relationships in the last 5 years. When Livia asked why he had never married, he replied with a phrase she kept as one keeps a key. "I've never met anyone who made me want to stop." She understood, because it was the same for her, only the other way around. She had never met anyone who wanted to stop for her. The treatment progressed. The first attempt at fertilization was unsuccessful. Livia received the negative result, sitting at the clinic's break room table during her lunch break, reading the message on her cell phone as if reading a weather report. She put her phone in her pocket, finished eating her sandwich, and went back to work. She only cried at night, lying on her side in bed, her hand on her empty stomach, biting the pillow so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Raphael called that night. It was the first time he had called. Until then, all communication had been by text message, always concise, always formal. His voice on the phone was different from how it sounded in person. Lower, closer. "I heard the result," he said. Livia didn't answer. She didn't trust her own voice. "Let's try again," he continued, "as many times as necessary." She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to say he didn't need to. She wanted to say maybe it would be better to give up, that maybe the universe was trying to tell her she wasn't made for this, that some people just weren't designed for certain things. But what came out of her mouth was a sob, and then another, and another. And then she was really crying. For the first time in years, her ear pressed against the phone, a man who barely knew her listening on the other end of the line. Raphael didn't say, "Everything will be all right." He didn't say, "I understand." He didn't say any of the things people usually say when they don't know what to say. He just stood there, silent, breathing along with her, like an anchor that doesn't need to be seen to fulfill its function. When Livia finally calmed down, he said, "I'll stop by at 7 tomorrow. We'll have coffee." And he hung up. He showed up at 6:55. He brought still warm cheese bread and brewed coffee in a thermos. They sat at the small kitchen table and ate in silence, their legs almost touching under the table because the space was cramped. And Livia realized at that moment, with her mouth full of cheese bread and her eyes still swollen from crying, that something between them had changed. There was no longer a contract. There were no more clauses. There were two people having coffee together on a cold morning, sharing a pain that no document could name. The second attempt at fertilization happened 2 months later. Livia tried not to get her hopes up, but it was impossible. Each hormone injection, each ultrasound, each blood test carried the weight of a prayer she never fully formulated, because she was afraid that the words, if spoken, would evaporate before they could get anywhere. The night before the results were announced, Raphael showed up at the apartment unannounced. He brought a book, a novel that Livia had mentioned in passing weeks earlier during a walk, and which she thought he hadn't heard. He handed it over without ceremony, like handing over a receipt. "I found it in a bookstore near the office." Livia held the book and felt its weight in her hands, as if it were made of something denser than paper, because that gesture meant that he listened, that he cherished her, that she existed enough in his life to occupy space in his memory. "Thank you," she said, and the word had more syllables than usual. They stayed up talking late that night. Livia made tea. Raphael sat on the floor because the armchair creaked when he sat down, and he decided the rug was safer. She told him about her mother, a simple woman, a seamstress, who died when Livia was 25 and left her the blue armchair and a sewing machine as her inheritance. That no longer worked, and a letter that Livia kept inside a book she never finished reading. In the letter, her mother said that her greatest fear in life was not dying, but dying without being sure that her daughter would be happy. Raphael listened to everything without interrupting, and when Livia finished, he said something she didn't expect. My father never wrote anything to me. When my mother died, he went to the gym the next day. He trained for 3 hours, came back, took a shower, and never mentioned her name again in the house. I grew up thinking that was strength. It took me 20 years to understand that it was fear. They looked at each other in that heavy silence that exists between two people who have just revealed scars they normally keep hidden. There was no hug. There was no touch. But there was something that was perhaps more intimate than any physical contact. There was trust. The result of the second attempt came on a Friday. Positive. Livia read the blood test results in the clinic bathroom, locked in a stall, her hands trembling so much she almost dropped her phone. Beta HCG positive. She read it 3 times. 4. 5. And then she leaned her head against the stall door and cried. But this time, it wasn't the cry of someone who has lost. It was the cry of someone who, finally, after a lifetime, finds something. He called Raphael. He answered on the first ring. Positive, she said, and her voice came out so choked that it took him a second to understand. And then there was silence. A silence unlike any other, a silence that wasn't empty but full of everything they hadn't said, full of fear and hope and gratitude and something else, something neither of them yet dared to name. Positive, he repeated, and his voice trembled in a way Livia had never heard before. That night, they had dinner together. Raphael cooked, or tried to. The rice ran out and the chicken dried out, but Livia ate everything as if it were the best dinner of her life, because in a way it was. They sat on the sofa afterward, side by side, with the empty plates on the coffee table and the television off, and stayed there in silence, staring at the wall like 2 astronauts who had just landed on an unknown planet and still didn't know if the air was breathable. I'm going to be a father, said Raphael, as if testing a sentence to see if it would hold up. You're going to be a father, Livia confirmed, and he smiled. Not his usual half-smile. A full, open smile that transformed his face in a way she didn't think possible. It was like watching a landscape change seasons in seconds. The same terrain, but completely different. The weeks that followed brought an intimacy that neither of them had planned. Raphael began accompanying Livia to her prenatal appointments. He sat beside her in the waiting room, rigid as always, but with an attentiveness that belied his posture. When the doctor showed her the first ultrasound, a tiny dot in a sea of gray, Raphael leaned forward in his chair and stared at the screen as if he were seeing something sacred. Livia looked at him, staring at the screen, and felt something break inside her, not from pain, but from something bursting forth to be born. He started going to her apartment more often. He brought a new chair for the kitchen because the old one was wobbling. He fixed the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for months. He installed a shelf on the wall of the room that would be the baby's, the room that, until then, had been a storage space for boxes and clothes that didn't fit in the closet. In every gesture, the practical aspect carried a subtext that they pretended not to notice. He was building a place, not just for the baby, for himself. Livia found herself watching his hands as he worked, large hands with visible veins, gripping the drill with the same concentration with which they leafed through reports. She thought about how strange it was that those hands, which commanded an entire company, were there, in her tiny apartment, assembling a crooked shelf. And she thought about what it would be like to feel those hands holding hers. And then she pushed the thought away as one pushes away an ember. Because she knew the rules. The contract was clear. The marriage was functional. The goal was the child. When the child was born, they would go on with their lives. As parents, yes, but not as a couple. There was no clause for love. There was no paragraph for the butterflies in her stomach she felt when he arrived. There was no legal article explaining why she fixed her hair before opening the door, or why he had started using a perfume she once mentioned liking. There were moments when the facade of indifference almost crumbled. Once, during a prenatal appointment, the doctor asked Livia to lie down on the examination table for the ultrasound. Raphael was sitting in the chair next to her, as always with his hands on his knees. When the doctor applied the gel to her belly and the image appeared on the screen, the fetus already with a recognizable human form, moving its arms, turning its head, the doctor said, "Do you want to hear the heartbeat?" He turned on the sound. The heartbeat filled the room like an underwater drum, fast and constant, the acoustic proof that there was someone alive and real inside. Livia closed her eyes and felt tears stream down her temples towards her hair. When she opened them, she saw Raphael standing beside the stretcher, his hand outstretched inches from hers, as if he wanted to hold her hand but didn't know if he was allowed. She moved her fingers and touched his hand. He closed his fingers around hers with a firmness that was almost painful. And they remained like that while the sound of their son's heart filled the silence. 2 people who had signed a contract not to feel anything, and yet felt everything. The doctor left the room to get something, and they were alone for a moment. Raphael didn't let go of her hand. He looked at the ultrasound screen where the frozen image of the baby remained like a suspended photograph and said, "Thank you for contacting me that day." Livia swallowed her emotion and replied, "Thank you for not laughing." I almost laughed. "You already said that." "It's because it's true, and because the almost is the most important part." She didn't understand at the time. She only understood weeks later, lying in bed, rethinking the phrase. He almost laughed, but he didn't, and in that almost lay all the difference between one life and another, between the Livia who would return to the empty apartment and the Livia who was there with a baby growing inside her and a man who held her hand during ultrasounds as if he were holding something too precious to describe. At work, Livia began to notice curious glances from her colleagues. Her belly was growing, and questions arose. Who was the father? When had they gotten married? Why had she never mentioned anyone? Livia responded with polite evasions that only increased the curiosity of others. One colleague, more daring than the others, asked directly, "Is it from that handsome patient who used to come here alone?" Livia felt her face heat up and changed the subject. But her colleague wasn't wrong, and the fact that other people could see what they were trying to hide both frightened and comforted her. There was a woman at the clinic, Donna Celia, the cleaning lady, a 60-year-old woman with calloused hands and a smile that made people feel at home, who had been watching Livia for years with that silent attention that only invisible people dedicate to one another. Late in the afternoon, while mopping the kitchen floor, Donna Celia said, without raising her eyes, "That boy who comes here every week, he looks at you in a way I've seen before." "What way?" asked Livia, feigning disinterest. "The attitude of someone who has found something and is afraid to lose it." Livia stood there with her cup in her hand without answering. Donna Celia finished cleaning the floor, put away the bucket, and left the pantry as if she hadn't said anything extraordinary. Because, for her, it hadn't. It was just the obvious, the kind of truth that everyone sees, except the two people involved. The pregnancy progressed. Livia gained weight, felt nauseous, and had inexplicable cravings for green mango with salt and vanilla ice cream on the same day. Raphael started bringing fruit and ice cream on visits without her having to ask. He memorized the medication schedules, researched fetal development, and bought a book about fatherhood that Livia saw hidden in his bag during a consultation. The cover folded inwards, as if he were ashamed to be seen reading it. One Saturday morning, when she was 5 months old, Raphael showed up with a large box. Inside, there was a disassembled crib made of light wood with hand-carved details. "It belonged to my mother," he said, without looking at her. "My father was going to throw it away after she died. I kept it." Livia looked at the crib pieces scattered on the living room floor and understood what he wasn't saying, that this crib was the only object he had kept from his mother, that he never imagined he would one day have a reason to take it out of storage, and that by bringing it there, to that small apartment, he was doing something much bigger than assembling a piece of furniture. He was reconnecting two ends of his life that he thought would never meet again. They assembled the crib together, one afternoon that stretched into the evening. They argued about screws, laughed at instructions that didn't make sense, and at one point, when they both tried to fit the same piece at the same time, their hands touched. It was a brief, accidental touch, lasting less than 2 seconds. But Livia felt as if an electric current had run through her entire body. And by the way Raphael withdrew his hand, he felt it too. Neither of them commented. They continued assembling the crib as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and they both knew it. From that day on, the distance between them, which was already small, became unbearable, not in the sense that there was conflict, in the sense that the proximity had become a magnetic field, and every time they tried to keep a safe distance, but some invisible force pushed them back. Raphael started having dinner at Livia's apartment almost every night. He would bring ingredients, she would cook, and he would sit in the new kitchen chair asking questions about spices as if he were attending a class. Afterward, they would sit on the sofa and talk about things that had nothing to do with the baby. About books, about the past, about the future, about nothing, about everything. And with each passing night, the moment of leaving became more difficult. He lingered longer at the door. She took longer to open it. One rainy night, when Livia was 6.5 months old, Raphael got up from the sofa to leave and she said, "It's raining heavily. You can stay." It was the first time she had offered. The phrase came out simply, almost casually, but they both knew it wasn't. He stood in the middle of the room, coat in hand, looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "I sleep on the couch," she said quickly, trying to downplay the impact of the statement. "You're 6 months pregnant. You're not going to sleep on the couch." "Then I'll sleep in the armchair." "Livia?" It was the first time he had spoken her name like that, not as the name of a business partner or a project collaborator, but as the name of someone who mattered. 2 syllables that carried something no contract could have foreseen. He stayed. He slept on the sofa, with his feet hanging off the edge because he was too tall for the upholstery. In the morning, Livia woke up and found him in the kitchen, trying to make coffee. He had put too much water in the filter and the coffee was watery, but she drank it without complaining, sitting in her chair while the rain continued outside, and thought that this was the most beautiful morning of her life. The following months were a silent negotiation between what they felt and what they had agreed upon. Raphael never verbalized it. Livia never asked. But the evidence piled up like proof in a court no one had summoned. The dinners that stretched until midnight, the hands that brushed too often to be coincidence, the glances that lasted a second longer than necessary, the way he talked to her belly when he thought she was asleep. Livia caught him once. She was almost asleep on the sofa after dinner when she felt his hand land, light as a bird, on her stomach. And then the deep, almost inaudible voice said, "I'm here. It may take a while, but I'm here." She kept her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, and felt tears trickle down her temples towards her hair. In the 8th month, something happened that forced them both to confront what they had been avoiding. Raphael's sister, an older woman named Helena, who lived in Sao Paulo and with whom he had little contact, came to visit him. She learned about the wedding and the pregnancy and showed up unannounced at his office, demanding explanations. Raphael tried to maintain the official version. A recent relationship, everything very fast, a mutual decision. But Helena was the type of person who could see through walls. She showed up at Livia's apartment on a Saturday morning alone. She knocked on the door with 2 sharp taps. Livia opened it and found herself facing a tall woman with eyes identical to Raphael's, who assessed her from head to toe with a frankness bordering on rudeness. "So it's you," said Helena. "It's me," Livia replied without backing down. Helena entered, looked around, and sat on the sofa as if she owned the place. She asked direct questions about the marriage, about the treatment, about what exactly Livia hoped to gain from all this. The questions were sharp, and behind them was a clear accusation. "You're using my brother." Livia listened to everything with the patience of someone who has heard worse. When Helena finished, she said, "I understand your concern, and I'm not going to try to convince you of anything. But I need you to know one thing. Your brother is the first person in many years who has treated me like a human being, not like an employee, not as a convenience, not as someone who is there to serve, as a person. If that's what using means, then I don't know what the word means anymore." Helena remained silent. She looked at Livia's belly, at her hands resting on her stomach, at the brown eyes that never wavered, and then she did something surprising. Her eyes welled up with tears. She stood up, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and before leaving said, "He never brought my mother's crib anywhere." And he left. That night, when Raphael arrived for dinner, Livia told him about the visit. He remained silent for a long time, fidgeting with his food without eating. And then he said, "She's right to be suspicious. We did everything backwards." Backwards from what?" "People meet, fall in love, get married, and then have children. We got married first, we're having a child, and—" He stopped mid-sentence. He looked at her. The air in the apartment seemed to thicken. "And what?" Livia asked, even though she knew, even though she was afraid to know. Raphael placed his fork on his plate. He rested his hands on the table. And he said, in the voice of someone confessing something they've kept to themselves for too long, "I don't know when it happened. I don't know if it was when you laughed at the way I was holding the spoon, or when I saw your books on the shelf, or when you cried on the phone and I stood there listening and wanted to be there with you. On the other side of the wall instead of on the other side of town. I don't know when, but it happened. And I need you to know, even if it changes everything, even if it breaks the contract, even if you ask me to leave, I fell in love with you, Livia. Not because of the deal, not because of the child, because of you." The silence that followed was unlike any previous silence. It was the silence of someone standing before an open door, needing to decide whether to enter. Livia felt the tears before she realized she was crying. Not from sadness, not from relief, from something that had no name in the language she knew, something between gratitude and astonishment and fear and peace, something that was like returning to a place you've never been, but that has always been yours. "I thought I was the only one," she said, and her voice came out broken, brittle, like a wall that finally gives way after bearing too much weight. Raphael stood up, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. He took her hands, those small hands that had spent her whole life holding things for others, and held them in his, and they stayed like that, she sitting, he kneeling, crying together in the cramped kitchen with the plates of food getting cold and the fluorescent light humming softly in a moment that wasn't cinematic, that wasn't perfect, that wasn't anything like what the movies show, but that was real, entirely, painfully, beautifully real. He slept there that night, not on the sofa, beside her, in the single bed that was too small for 2 people, with his arms around her and her belly where their child was growing. And for the first time in many years, Livia slept without fear of waking up. The days that followed were like learning a new language. They already knew each other. They knew each other's habits, tastes, fears, silences. But now they needed to relearn everything in a different light. The gesture that was once a courtesy became affection. The presence that was once planned became a shared experience. It became a choice. And each moment together had a different quality, as if the same song were playing in a key that was finally right. Raphael canceled the termination clause in the contract. He called his lawyer, asked him to remove the paragraph, and then called Livia to tell her. She was on the bus, coming home from work, squeezed between two passengers with the phone pressed to her ear. "I canceled the trip," he said. "The way out?" "From the contract, the part that said we would separate after the baby was born." She remained silent, gripping the bus's handrail with one hand and her phone with the other, while the city rushed past the window. "What does that mean?" she asked, even though she knew. "It means I want to stay." The passenger next to her must have found it strange that the pregnant woman started smiling alone on the bus at 6:30 p.m. on a typical Tuesday. But Livia didn't care, because at that moment, cramped, tired, with swollen feet and her cell phone hot against her ear, she felt something she thought she would never feel. She felt chosen. The baby was born early on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Livia woke up with contractions and called Raphael, who crossed the city in 20 minutes, a journey that normally took 40. He arrived at the hospital with his shirt inside out and his shoes mismatched, and Livia, between contractions, laughed at the way he was dressed. "You're wearing your left shoe on your right foot," she said, holding her belly. "I know," he replied, taking her hand. "It doesn't matter." The labor lasted 6 hours. Raphael stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand with a strength that probably left marks, but which she didn't feel because the pain of bringing a life into the world occupied every inch of her body. And when the baby's cry filled the room, a high-pitched, indignant, utterly alive sound, they both cried too. It was a girl, small, red-faced, with her eyes closed and her fists clenched as if she were already ready to face the world. The nurse placed the baby on Livia's chest, and she felt the weight, light and immense at the same time, of that life against her own. She looked at her daughter and saw, in that crumpled face, everything she had hoped for, lost, searched for, and finally found. Raphael approached, looked at his daughter and then at Livia, and said, "Thank you." Words were insufficient, and he knew it. But it was all he could say at that moment, because there are feelings that are too great for any language to express. They named her Aurora, not because it was a trendy name or because they had researched meanings on parenting websites, but because it was the name Raphael's mother never used, the name she had chosen for a daughter she never had. Helena told Livia, weeks before, during a second visit that was completely different from the first. Sitting in the same blue armchair, with tears in her eyes, Helena said that her mother always wanted a daughter and that the chosen name was Aurora, because she used to say that daughters are like the dawn. They arrive when the night already seems eternal. When Livia told Raphael, he remained silent for a long time. Then he simply said, "Aurora," and the name stuck. The first few weeks with the baby were a beautiful chaos. Sleepless nights, bottles, diapers, crying that had no explanation and stopped for no reason. Livia moved into Raphael's apartment, bigger, quieter, with space for the wooden crib that now had an occupant. The move wasn't planned. It happened gradually, one suitcase at a time, until one day all of Livia's things were there and the apartment in Katagam was empty. The first few days in the hospital were a timeless bubble. The outside world continued, the traffic, the news, the bills to pay. But inside that room with its light-colored walls, there were only 3 people learning to coexist. Livia spent hours watching Aurora sleep in her hospital crib, counting her fingers and toes as if she needed to confirm that everything was real. Raphael slept in the armchair next to the bed, his neck at an angle that certainly hurt, but which he never mentioned. On the second night, a nurse went in to check Aurora's vital signs and found Livia awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Can't you sleep?" the nurse asked, adjusting the monitor. "I'm afraid to go to sleep and wake up and she's not here," Livia replied, with an honesty that surprised her. The nurse smiled with the understanding of someone who had heard it 100 times before. "She's here, and she'll still be here tomorrow." Livia nodded, but didn't sleep until the sun rose and the light streamed in through the window, illuminating her daughter's face with a golden glow that justified the name they had chosen. When they were discharged, Raphael brought the car to the hospital door. He had installed the car seat 3 days earlier. Livia knew because he casually mentioned that he had watched 4 YouTube videos to make sure he was doing it right. He drove back to the apartment at 30 kilometers per hour, both hands on the steering wheel, his eyes alternating between the road and the rearview mirror, where he could see Aurora in the reflection. Livia, sitting in the back seat next to her daughter, looked out the window and thought the city seemed different. The same streets, the same buildings, the same traffic, but everything seemed washed away, as if someone had wiped away a layer of dust she didn't know existed. When they arrived at the apartment and Raphael opened the door, Livia entered with Aurora in her arms and stopped in the middle of the living room. Something was different. She looked around and saw In the corner, near the window, there was a new armchair, large, padded, the kind that reclines. Next to it, a small table with a warm light lamp. In the baby's room, which she already knew, Raphael's mother's crib was set up with new sheets, and there was a star mobile hanging that slowly rotated with the draft from the half-open window. "When did you do that?" she asked. "Last week, while you were hospitalized for your final tests." Livia looked at the spinning mobile, at the armchair, at the crib, and felt a wave of something greater than gratitude. It was the realization that this man, whom she had known only as a name on a medical record, had become the person preparing the world for the arrival of their daughter. Not with grandeur, with lamps and mobiles and a carefully chosen armchair. Raphael was clumsy as a first-time father. He held Aurora as if she were made of glass, changed diapers with surgical concentration that took 3 times longer than it should, and woke up in the middle of the night before Livia even heard him cry, as if his body had developed a radar for his daughter. And in every clumsy gesture, in every failed attempt to burp the baby, in every song he sang, she improvised songs because she didn't know any lullabies, and Livia watched a man transform before her eyes. The rigidity vanished like ice in the sun. What remained was something she never imagined seeing in him: tenderness. There was one night, Aurora was 3 weeks old, when Livia woke up and didn't find Raphael in bed. She got up and went to the baby's room. He was sitting in the nursing chair, an armchair he had bought without her asking, with Aurora asleep on his chest, small as a kitten, her tiny hand clutching his index finger, and he was crying. Silently, without a sound, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter with an expression Livia had only seen in Renaissance paintings. A mixture of devotion and awe, as if he were facing something he didn't deserve, but had received nonetheless. Livia didn't go into the room. She stood at the door, watching, her hand on her chest, feeling her heart beat so hard it seemed to want to burst out of her body. And, in that moment, she understood something that would take some time to put into words. That love isn't found. It's built, brick by brick, gesture by gesture, sleepless night by sleepless night. It's made of small things: homemade soup, cinnamon sticks, an inherited crib, a cherished name. It's made of presence when it would be easier to leave. It's made of staying. Months passed. Aurora grew up, from a tiny dot on the ultrasound to a smiling baby, then to a child crawling around the apartment with a determination reminiscent of her mother, and a seriousness reminiscent of her father. Raphael and Livia never had a wedding ceremony. They never wore rings. They never said, "I love you," in a solemn or memorable way, but they lived a love that was as present as the air, invisible, essential, and only noticed when it threatened to run out. One autumn afternoon, when Aurora was 1 year old, Livia was sitting in the park near the building, watching her daughter play in the grass with a dry leaf that seemed to be the most fascinating thing in the universe. Raphael sat down next to her on the bench. He didn't say anything. He just stayed there, looking at his daughter, his arm resting on Livia's. "I've never told you something," said Livia without taking her eyes off Aurora. "What?" "That day, in the clinic's meeting room, when I made the proposal, I thought you were going to laugh in my face. I almost laughed." She looked at him, surprised. "Not out of mockery," he explained, "out of astonishment. Because no one had ever looked at me and told me the truth like that. Without beating around the bush, without games, without ulterior motives. You simply said what you wanted. And I thought, this woman is the bravest person I've ever met. It wasn't courage, it was desperation. Sometimes it's the same thing." Aurora dropped the paper and looked at her parents with that unmotivated smile that only children have. A smile that exists simply because existing is reason enough to smile. Livia smiled back. Raphael held her hand, and the 3 of them stayed there on the park bench while the sun slowly set and the shadows stretched across the grass like fingers, searching for something they had lost. That night, after putting Aurora to bed, Livia went to the box where she kept her mother's belongings. She opened the book she never finished reading and took out the letter. She sat on the bed and reread the words she already knew by heart. "My greatest fear is not dying. It's dying without being sure that you will be happy." She folded the letter, put it back in the book, and rested her head on the pillow. From the kitchen came the sound of Raphael washing the dishes. He had learned to enjoy it, the repetitive rhythm of the water and soap, the simple act of taking care of things after they had been used. From the next room came Aurora's soft breathing, rhythmic like a biological metronome. And Livia, lying in that bed that was now for 2 people, with her mother's letter inside the book beside her, listening to the sounds of an inhabited house, thought that if she could write a letter back, she would only say, "Mom, I'm happy." And it was true. Not the happiness of the movies, perfect, illuminated, accompanied by a soundtrack. It was real happiness. The kind that comes after pain, the kind that is built with your own hands, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that exists quietly, like a river that flows underground, invisible, but alive. Always alive. Outside, the city slept. The lights in the buildings were going out one by one like candles blown out by a gentle breeze. Somewhere, a mother cradled her child. Somewhere, a man wept alone. Somewhere, a woman made plans that the world would call crazy. And somewhere, in an 8th-floor apartment, in a neighborhood not mentioned in tourist guides, in a life that isn't news anywhere, a woman who was once invisible slept next to. A man who was once armored, while in the next room, a girl named Aurora dreamed dreams that didn't yet have names. And everything was fine. Not perfect. Okay. And that was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Helena returned for Christmas. She brought too many presents and a rigidity that lasted exactly until the moment Aurora reached out to her and said something that vaguely sounded like, "Ina." The woman who had interrogated Livia months before with the coldness of a prosecutor melted right there in the living room, with her niece in her arms. And Livia saw in her eyes the same thing she saw in Raphael's eyes, a hunger to belong, a hunger for family. That hunger that strong people disguise as self-sufficiency, but which never completely disappears. The supper was simple. Livia cooked rice, farofa, chicken, vinaigrette, potato salad. Raphael tried to help and was gently expelled from the kitchen after confusing salt with sugar when seasoning the meat. Helena set the table with a military meticulousness that revealed where Raphael had inherited his posture from. And Aurora sat in the high chair, tapping a plastic spoon on the tray, as if conducting an orchestra that only she could hear. When they sat down to eat, Helena raised her glass, wine for herself and Raphael, juice for Livia, and said, "The last time this family sat down together at a Christmas table, I was 32 years old and my mother was still alive. That was almost a decade ago. I didn't think it would happen again." Her voice faltered on the last sentence. Raphael placed his hand on his sister's shoulder. Livia held his hand under the table, and Aurora continued banging her spoon, indifferent to the weight of the moment, because small children have the involuntary wisdom to exist in the present without carrying the burden of the past. The following months brought the routine that only real families know, that mixture of sacred boredom and predictable chaos that constitutes the raw material of ordinary life. Aurora took her first steps one Sunday morning, holding onto Raphael's leg, who was walking with a... She lay back in the room with her arms outstretched like a goalkeeper waiting for the ball. Livia filmed it with her cell phone, and the video, shaky, poorly framed, with the sound of her laughter in the background, became the most precious record she possessed. There was a moment, shortly after her first steps, that Livia remembered as a silent turning point. She was at the supermarket with Aurora in the cart, choosing fruit, when a woman approached and said, "Your daughter is beautiful. Does she have her father's eyes?" Livia stood still for a second, a mango in her hand, processing the sentence. Her daughter, her father's eyes? The woman knew nothing. She knew nothing about the contract, the clinic, the fertilization. She simply saw a mother and daughter at the supermarket and treated the scene as what it was. Normal. Absolutely, beautifully normal. "Yes, they do," Livia replied. "Their eyes are exactly the same." And it was true. Aurora had Raphael's dark, intense eyes, that gaze that seemed to see more than it should, that weighed on things with a seriousness that didn't suit such a small child. But she also had something of Livia. Her mouth, the way she tilted her head when she was curious, the way she held things with both hands, as if each object deserved her full attention. Livia left the supermarket that day with shopping bags in her arms and Aurora in the stroller, and for the first time in a long time she didn't feel invisible, not because anyone had seen her, but because she finally saw herself. There were also Saturday mornings that had become rituals. Raphael would wake up first, he always woke up first, his body still programmed for the corporate routine, and go to the bakery at the end of the street. He would return with warm French bread, Minas cheese, and sometimes a cornbread cake that the baker only made on weekends. Livia would prepare the coffee with cinnamon. Aurora would sit in the high chair with pieces of bread scattered across the tabletop like a map of imaginary continents. And they would have breakfast together, mostly in silence, with the radio playing softly in the kitchen and the morning light streaming through the window with that gentleness that only Saturday mornings have. It was in those moments that Livia felt most clearly the magnitude of what she had built. Not the practical dimension, the apartment, the routine, the stability, but the human dimension. The table with 3 seats, the sound of someone chewing, the sound of a voice saying, "Pass the butter." Small things, things that most people have without realizing it and that she, for a long time, thought she would never have. Raphael one morning looked at her over his coffee cup and said, "What are you thinking about?" "Not at all. That's a lie. You're always thinking about something when you stare at your coffee like that." She smiled. "I'm thinking that warm French bread is one of the best things in the world." He didn't insist. But he smiled too, because he knew it wasn't about the bread. It was never about the bread. Livia resigned from the clinic, not immediately, and not because of pressure from Raphael. It was a decision that matured over months, like fruit on a tree. She realized she could no longer sit at that table, organizing those medical records, typing those words, embryo, cycle, attempt, without feeling like she was betraying anything. Not the patients, herself. Because she had been that woman, the one who arrived at the clinic with eyes full of hope and left with empty arms. And now that her arms were full, staying there seemed like a way of pretending that nothing had changed when everything had. She started working as a freelancer, doing administrative work from home. She earned less, but she had something no salary can buy. Time. Time to watch Aurora wake up. Time to have coffee without rushing. Time to exist within her own life instead of running alongside it, trying to catch up. Raphael, for his part, changed in ways he himself wouldn't have foreseen. The man who used to dine alone in restaurants every night now arrived home at 6:30 and asked what was for dinner. The man who never missed work began taking Fridays off to take Aurora to the park. The man who held a wooden spoon as if it were a weapon now made cheese omelets with a skill that Livia would describe as acceptable with reservations. And the man who had never said, "I love you," because he thought words were less important than the feeling, began to say them, not in grand moments, but in small ones. Passing through the kitchen on his way to the shower, turning off the bedroom light, leaving for work with his keys in hand. "I love you." 3 words he distributed like someone placing objects in their proper places, without ceremony, without drama, but with the precision of someone who knows that everything has its place, and that those words belonged there, between them, every day. When Aurora turned 2, they had a small party at the apartment. Helena came, along with 2 of Livia's former work colleagues, the lawyer who drafted the original contract, and who was now a friend of Raphael's, and an elderly neighbor who lived downstairs and had grown fond of the little girl. The lawyer, a bald man named Sergio, with a dry sense of humor that contrasted with the seriousness of his profession, pulled Raphael aside during the party and said, "You know, in 20 years of my career, the contract I drafted for you is the only one I'm happy didn't work out." Raphael smiled. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The neighbor, Donna Ivone, an 82-year-old woman who lived alone and had adopted Aurora as her step-granddaughter, sat on the sofa with the girl in her lap and told stories that mixed memory and invention. Aurora listened with wide eyes, not understanding half the words, but fascinated by the sound of the aged voice that rose and fell like a song. Livia looked at that scene and thought about how loneliness is a silent epidemic. Donna Ivone, Raphael, herself, all had been lonely in their own way, and now they were there, together, in an apartment full of balloons and crumbs of cake, proving that loneliness is not a sentence. It's a waiting room. The cake was chocolate, made by Livia, and had a crooked frosting that Aurora smashed with both hands before anyone could sing "Happy Birthday." Amidst the mess, with chocolate on the floor and balloons deflating in the corner, Raphael approached Livia and said, "I brought something." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside were 2 simple gold rings. No diamonds, no adornments. Just 2 smooth circles reflecting the light of the room. Livia looked at the rings and then at him. "We're already married," she said, her voice trembling. "On paper. Now I want it to be real." He placed the ring on her finger. She placed the ring on his finger. And in that gesture, performed in a room filled with pieces of cake and crepe paper with a child covered in chocolate and an elderly neighbor clapping, there was more truth than in any cathedral ceremony. Aurora, indifferent to the significance of the moment, offered her father a piece of squashed cake. He took it, ate it, and made a face that made the girl giggle. And Livia looked at that scene, the man she thought would be just a name on a contract, the daughter she thought she would never have, the life she didn't dare imagine, and felt something that was both light and heavy, simple and enormous. He felt he belonged, not to a place, not to a person, but to that life, to that version of herself she never imagined existed. The woman who one day proposed a fake marriage to a stranger in a meeting room, not out of strategy, but out of desperation, transformed into courage. The woman who accepted being vulnerable in front of someone who was also vulnerable, and who discovered that it is precisely in the crack that the light enters. Sometimes, at night, when the house was quiet and Raphael slept beside her, breathing heavily like someone who had finally learned to rest, Livia would stay awake for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the creaking of the floorboards, her daughters breathing through the baby monitor. And I thought that life is strange, that the best things she had came from the most crooked paths, that the love she found didn't come from a passionate glance or a cinematic coincidence, but from a spreadsheet, a medical record, an absurd proposal made by a woman who thought she deserved nothing and who, having nothing to lose, risked everything. And I thought that maybe, just maybe, that was the secret no one tells you about love, that it doesn't arrive fully assembled. It arrives in pieces, like the wooden crib Raphael brought from his mother. It requires patience it fits together, with hands that accept trembling, with time that no one can rush. And when it's finally ready, it's not perfect. It creaks a little, it has marks, but it holds. It holds the weight of a lifetime, and that was what they had built. Not a fairy tale, Not a perfect love story, but a true love story, with bent screws, watered down coffee, overcooked rice, and a contract that turned into an alliance, with a woman who was invisible and became the center of someone's life, with a man who was shielded and learned to open the door, and with a girl named Aurora, because someone, many years ago, believed that after the longest night, the sun always returns, and always turn.